Hey all, samrob2020.com, and I'm here to talk to you about a serious subject, COVID-19, about what we've learned from it and what I hope that we've learned from it, I should say. First off, I want to acknowledge that overall, I think we are very fortunate. We are dealing with a difficult situation, and I know that it is serious. I know that there are going to be people who die, and I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to point out that I think that overall things are going to be better than they could have been. There is the potential that things could have been a lot worse, and I think due to uh, some of the procedures, some of the policies, the social distancing that we've been practicing at the individual, at the family, at the community levels, at the corporate levels where companies have volunteered to send people home and to shut down or to have people work from home. All of those are succeeding in helping flatten the curve so that the impact of COVID-19, as bad as it is far less serious and far less widespread than it could have been. And I think we need to acknowledge that. I think we need to acknowledge that COVID-19 is a wake up call. If we look at the past decades, we see things like bird flu, H1N1, MERS, SARS, now COVID-19. You've got the seasonal flus, scarier things like Ebola outbreaks in Africa. We've learned a lot from the responses to each one of those, but one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that it's not stopping and that it could have been a lot worse this time around. So that this is a wake up call for us. Scary as it is, COVID 19 is not what they call a slate wiper. It's not going to lead to some apocalyptic end of the world scenario. It's frightening, but it's not terrifying. We're learning a lot from it, how to deal with a new, highly contagious infectious disease, one that's widespread worldwide, a pandemic. And I'm glad we're learning that now because while I do not believe that COVID 19 was designed, I am very much afraid that the next one might be. As technology advances, as genetic engineering becomes more widespread, we are going to see the possibility of an engineered COVID 19. We're going to see individuals, I'm afraid, or organizations who look at what happened and what our response was to COVID 19 and see that uh, this infectious disease was capable of bringing down major world powers, crashing economies possibly. And they may intend to do it for their own gain or do it intentionally in order to harm others. So we need to be aware of that. We need to acknowledge that that is a real risk. And we need to ask ourselves, looking at our response to this situation, what have we learned from it? The very first thing I think we need to acknowledge is that we were not prepared. Organization and coordination are hard, especially when you're doing it across multiple levels, international level, talking about the state level, talking about the local level. So that's something that we need to pay attention to. That's something that we need to make deliberate. That's something we need to practice going forward. Second thing I think we need to acknowledge is that centralization kills. Top-down hierarchies fail. We need a distributed, scalable response system. And that includes medical services, that includes emergency services, that includes peacekeeping services. That means spreading capabilities and responsibilities across all levels, and even pushing them all the way down to the family and even the individual level. Telling people you're responsible for yourself. You need to take care of yourself. You're responsible for taking care of your family. You're responsible for taking care of your community. The way that we successfully deal with this sort of pandemic is to organize from the bottom up, not to impose order from the top down. The third thing we've learned is that regulations restrict response. Federal, state, and local regulations all impeded initial efforts to deal with COVID 19. We had to suspend over 100 rules and regulations just to get things rolling. And even after that, we're still struggling with rules and regulations regarding production of needed materials, restrictions on research, regulations preventing innovations in treatment and production of new equipment. Um, we need to acknowledge that if we put these regulations back, the next time around, we're going to have the exact same problems. We don't need to just suspend these regulations. We need to eliminate them. Fourth thing I think we need to acknowledge is that proximity causes problems. The cities and the high density population areas are the ones that are being hardest hit by COVID-19, which makes sense. They're a place where it's easier, even in the presence of social distancing, even in the presence of good hygiene and the best intentions. Those are the places where it's easiest to spread an infectious disease. And we need to acknowledge, I think, going forward, that what is appropriate measures for dealing with an infectious disease in a city is not what should be used in rural Iowa. And both of those are very different from what should happen in a more suburban area. So we need to tailor our responses. We need different strategies for cities, urban, suburban, and rural areas. Number five, and finally, I think we need to understand that single source means a single point of failure. If I've got prepper friends, and honestly, in this situation, you probably do too. If you haven't thought about preparing for a disaster, now is a good time to give it some thought because, like I said, this is going to happen again, I'm afraid. But preppers have a saying, they say two is one and one is none. Things break, things wear out, or just aren't available when you need them. A single source of anything is, of course, a point of failure. That goes for masks, that goes for ventilators, that goes for medicines, that goes for treatment facilities, right? It doesn't matter if you're talking about something that is sourced from one company or sourced from one country. If anything happens to that source, you are out of luck. So the smart thing to do is to make sure that we have multiple redundant sources, that we are capable of managing supply, research and development, manufacturing, distribution through many different channels. So that in the event that we end up in a situation like this, we are not wholly dependent on, say, one company that is supplying a certain type of equipment that happens to have to shut down because they were an epicenter of the disease. That would be horrible. That would be unthinkable, and we need to make sure that it is unthinkable. That means encouraging a truly free market capable of meeting those needs. I said this is a serious talk, and it is. We are talking about the lessons that we need to learn from COVID-19, and ultimately, I think what we're finding out is that we need to rely on each other. We need to trust each other, and we need to trust that all of us working together will serve all of our best interests in trying to combat something like this. We can't rely on the government. The government is the exact opposite of what we want. The government represents centralization. The government represents regulation. The government recommends a single source of failure. What we need is for the government to get out of the position of dictating, of regulating, of overseeing pandemic response, and get them to the point where they are coordinating the individual, the family, the community, the company and corporate responses across the board and helping keep everybody on the same page and driving in the same direction by encouraging, by informing, but not by dictating, not by regulating, not by directing, because that is going to be a recipe for disaster. For our next pandemic, people are going to tell you we need more government, and I'm here to tell you that's the exact wrong thing to do. This is Sam Robb, samrob2020.com.